In the name of Allah Almighty, the most beneficent and the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum everyone. It is lecture number 14 of History of English Literature 1, and today our topic of discussion is poets of the later Victorian period, the pre-Raphaelite movement, the decadent and aesthetic. In previous lecture, I taught novelists and prose writers of the early Victorian period, so it means that we are done with studying uh, poets, novelists, and prose writers of early Victorian period, and now the turn comes of the later Victorian period, in which we will first of all we will discuss the poets of this period. So, lecture contents are introduction, what is pre-Raphaelite, poets of the later Victorian period, the decadent or aesthetic movement, and at the end there is conclusion. Starting with introduction, in the later Victorian period, a movement took place in English poetry which resembled something like a new romantic revival. So it means that in the later Victorian period, there was some kind of movement in English poetry which was more like a romantic revival, because after Romanticism there was, or after Romantic period there was Victorian period, and in the early phase of the Romantic Victorian period there was focus on reason, there was focus on science, on discoveries, and it was more uh, oriented toward realism, like realist themes were there. All right, unlike the romantic themes, like themes of happiness, themes of beauty, themes of nature. So early in a early Victorian period, there were different aspects, different subjects of discussion for the poets and the novelists. That is why this Victorian period has been divided into two, for the two periods, the early Victorian period and the later Victorian period. So this period was called as the pre-Raphaelite movement and was dominated by a new set of poets, Rossetti, Swinburne, and Morris. So since there were new topics, new subjects, new themes on which poetry was being written, that is why there were different poets who carried on this tradition. They were D.G., Rossetti, Swinburne, and Morris. They were interested simply in beauty. They were quite satisfied with the beauty of diction, beauty of rhythm, and the beauty of imagery in poetry. There's again the concept of beauty is being repeated here. The theme of beauty is being repeated here, and it's not the beauty of only of the beauty of the nature or the beauty of any other thing, but that beauty is beauty of diction, beauty of the words, beauty of rhythm. Rhythm means the flow in the poetry, and beauty of imagery in poetry. Yes, what is pre-Raphaelite? As I have talked about it in the topic, so let's discuss what is pre-Raphaelite. Pre-Raphaelite is a group of young British Brotherhood painters who banded together in 1848 in research against what they conceived as artificial historical painting of Royal Academy, and who sought to express a new moral seriousness and sincerity in their works. Pre-Raphaelite is also called as Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and it was basically a group of young painters, young British painters, and who thought that there was, artificial historical paintings in the Royal Academy. So they wanted to bring something new in the painting. That is something which is serious and which is sincere in their works. So what happened? They, along with doing painting, they also started writing. It means that they started painting in the form of words. Poem is also called as a picture in the form of the words. So whatever they used to paint, they just started writing in the form of poetry. So that group is called as Pre-Raphaelite group, and they brought a new trend in writing in the field of poetry. That is why in later Victorian period there is a different concept, different themes on which poetry was written. So here's a list of poets of the later Victorian period. First of all, we have Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Christiana Rossetti, William Morris, Algernon Charles Swinburne. Okay, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, he and Christiana Rossetti, they are siblings. So she was her his sister. All right. So first we have Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Rossetti was the chief force behind the Pre-Raphaelite movement. He was the son of Gabriel Rossetti, an Italian refugee. So he was basically he was the first person, or you can say the chief force behind this movement. He was son of Gabriel Rossetti, an Italian refugee who was a poet himself and a man of sterling character. Sterling means outstanding character. He was, an Italian refugee. Refugee is one who takes escape from some place because of the atrocities afflicted upon them. And he was Italian basically, and Luigi Rossetti was his son, and he was a man of sterling character. Luigi Rossetti studied drawing and as a young man became one of the most enthusiastic members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was at the middle of the century to convert England from conventional art. D.G. Rossetti was basically a painter. He studied art and he knew how to do drawings, and he also became the member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, so which was at the middle of the century to convert England from conventional art. So they wanted to bring innovation in the field of art, and from that point they moved toward writing poetry. So characteristics of his poetry. In his poetry, Rossetti assumes forever the reality and immanence of spiritual and moral world. Immanence means presence of spiritual and moral world. So this is what he wanted to do, but he is not a consciously didactic poet. Didactic means teaching, means a work of art which is written for the purpose of teaching moral values to the people. So he was not of that sort. Rather, although he had talked about the spiritual and the moral world, but his purpose was not, he did not do it consciously, that he did not want to teach it to the people. On the other hand, the form and substance of his utterance are so perfected in truth and virility of thought. Virility means strength of thought, in majesty and grace of speech. Majesty means of high value, of high level. So his speech was so high, and his utterance, whatever he used to communicate, it was so perfected in truth, and there was also strength of thought. Whatever thought he had, it was, strong in every sense that the reader is unconsciously affected by them. So reader is unconsciously affected by the thought, by the truth, and by the thought that he communicated. Rossetti was a supreme master of rhythm and music. He cast his great historical lyrics in the highest narrative, that is to say, the ballad form. So he was a master of rhythm. Rhythm means, the musical effect in the poetry. There's, rhyming scheme, which makes, it gives it a musical effect. So he cast his great historical lyrics. Lyrics means that, the verses of the song in highest narrative, that is to call the ballad form. Ballad is also a kind of song, so he wrote his poetry mainly in ballad form. The vivid and intense simplicity of his diction. Vivid means clear, clear and intense simplicity of his diction. The verbal flashes of his ballad style seem to correspond with the tone and method of his watercolor painting. The way he has used his diction, its simplicity, the verbal flashes, verbal flashes related to his audio. Whenever you just read his poems, you just feel that there is some kind of impact which is pleasing to the ears. It seemed to correspond, it seemed to match with the tone and method of his watercolor painting. So it is like he had painted a picture with words. The works of the D.G. Rossetti includes Rossetti's poetry can be divided into two groups, the personal and the impersonal poems. These personal poems are In the House of Life Sonnets, Dante at Verona, The Stream's Secret, The Portrait. Impersonal poems are Rosemary, The Blessed, The White Ship, The King's Tragedy, The Bride's Pleasure, Sister Helen. Christiana Rossetti. Though Christiana Rossetti naturally displayed a temperament akin to her brother's. Temperament means, your behavior, your set of mind. It matched. Akin means equal to her brother, and sometimes undoubtedly wrote to some extent under his inspiration. She was inspired from her brother as well, and whatever she wrote, it had, impact of his brother. Large parts and some of the best parts of her poetical accomplishment. Accomplishments mean achievements. So whatever he has composed as in the form of poem, it was basically inspired from her brother, and are quite distinct from anything of his. And also, although she was inspired from her brother, but whatever she wrote, it was different from his brothers. Characteristics of her poetry. Her sonnet sequences have the same Italian form and the same characteristics of color, music, and meditation as those of Rossetti, because the sonnet form exercised its strong restraint. So the sonnet, she used to write poetry in the form of sonnets, unlike her brother Gigi Rossetti, who wrote poetry in the form of ballad. So the sonnet sequences have the same Italian form and same characteristics of color, music, and meditation. Like the musical effect was the same almost like of her brother, and because the sonnet form exercised its strong restraint. But her lyrics have lighter, more bird-like movement and voice than the stately lyrics of Rossetti. But if we compare the lyric form, the lyrics, the verses, the words, the line length, the meter, the meter length of the verse, it is more lighter, it is more bird-like movement, go slowly, and voice than the stately lyrics of the Rossetti. So her lyrics are different from that of Rossetti. Her range was distinctly wide. Her works include Goblin Market and other poems in 1861, The Prince's Progress in 1886, Pageant and other poems in 1881. So these are the year of publications of these poems. Next, we have William Morris, 1834 to 96. William Morris, who was an eminent designer and decorator besides being a poet, was chiefly interested in the Middle Ages. So he was an eminent. Eminent means famous designer and decorator, along with being poet, and he was interested in the Middle Ages. Middle Ages is a time period in the history which ranges from 1100 to 1500, when there was almost negligible work in the field of literature, although there were many poets, novelists, and prose writers who were composing their works, but there were no big names, and as well as no great work was produced. That is why it is Middle Ages, it is called Middle Ages. Okay, so he was interested in that age, and he was also a designer. Characteristics of his poetry are: his object of writing poetry was to revive the true Gothic spirit. Gothic is related to the Middle Ages, so he wanted to revive that spirit, and these poems interpreted ardors. Ardors means enthusiasm. So these poems interpreted enthusiasm and mysteries of the Middle Ages, which the Victorians had forgotten. So this was the area on which Victorians had not worked. So that was the enthusiasm, the energy, that was communicated through the poems of the Middle Ages. So that they were considered as subject of discussion by William Morris. Morris is a Raphaelite in the sense that he wrote poetry mainly with the object of creating beauty. So yes, it is important to discuss that why Morris is included in the category of poets of later Victorian period, one of the members of the pre-Raphaelite movement, because he wrote poetry with the object of creating beauty. He wanted to create beauty through his diction, through his style, through his rhythm, the rhyme scheme that he has used in his poetry. That is why he is called as pre-Raphaelite. And also he was a designer, which means that he was related to some field of art like Gigi Rossetti, Christiana Rossetti. Gigi Rossetti was painter, and William Morris was a designer. So both of them related to some field of art. So his works include The Life and Death of Jason and Earthly Paradise. Next we have Algernon Charles Swinburne from 1837 to 1909. Beside Rossetti and Morris, Swinburne was another Victorian poet who is reckoned with the pre-Raphaelites. Unlike the other members of the group, Swinburne was a musician rather than a painter. So along with Rossetti and Morris, Swinburne was another Victorian poet who is reckoned. Reckoned means counted, who is considered, who is just considered equal with the pre-Raphaelites. So unlike the other members of the group like Gigi Rossetti, who was a painter, and William Morris, who was a designer, Swinburne was a musician rather than a painter. So that is what is the characteristics of his personality and his characteristics of Swinburne, which made him be included in the group of pre-Raphaelite poets. So all of them belong to the similar professions. That is why they came up with the same idea of presenting beauty through their poetry, presenting beauty through their diction, their style, and so on. Okay, so characteristics of his poetry. Swinburne's poetry deals with great romantic themes like Shelley's revolt against society, the hatred of kings and priests, and the struggle against conventional morality. The themes of Swinburne's poetry are related to the, some kind of rebellious themes like the drastic change that took place in the past. For example, Shelley's revolt against society. Shelley was the poet who revolted against the society. We have also studied about it in the previous lectures. The hatred of kings and priests and the struggle against conventional morality. So he had themes like Shelley's, and he talked about him as well. He was also inspired by the French romantics, Victor Hugo and Baudelaire. The appearance of his poems and ballads in 1866 created great excitement. So he was also inspired by the French romantics, French romantic poets and writers as well. And his poems and ballads in 1866 created great excitement. His works include Before the Beginning of the Years, Atalanta in Calydon, Bothwell, Mary Stuart. So he's talked about different topics in his poems. The decadent or aesthetic movement. So aesthetic, as the name shows, it is related to the appreciation of beauty. So that definitely the pre-Raphaelite movement was based on the subject of the beauty and also incorporated the theme of the beauty in their poems. So it is almost similar to that. The pre-Raphaelite movement in English poetry was followed by decadent or aesthetic movement, though it is not so well defined. In the later part of the 19th century, there was a tendency among the literary artists to lay greater emphasis on the idea of art for art's sake. In literature, there are two concepts. One is art for art's sake and art for life's sake. Art for art's sake means you write poetry, you compose novels or any other piece of literature like dramas or whatever. They are for the sake of getting pleasure. They are just written for the sake of enjoyment of the readers. So there is no deliberate attempt to make these pieces of art as a source of moral teachings to the people. When we talk about art for life's sake, so it is also called as didactic, and which has moral purpose, and this art is written for the sake of getting some moral teachings and moral lessons from the poetry, like the Greek literature, Roman literature, and even in the the literature written in the neoclassical age as well. It was based on the didactic or art for life's sake. Here we have the art for art's sake. So this decadent or aesthetic movement's purpose was to write poetry or write any piece of literature with the perspective of art for art's sake. They were obviously influenced by Walter Pater and the French authors like Baudelaire and Verlaine, who tried to break with conventional rules. So they were also influenced by this Walter Pater. Walter Pater is a prose writer of the later Victorian period, and we will also discuss about him in the next lecture. So other French authors like Baudelaire and Verlaine, they were the ones who actually broke the conventional values, conventional way of writing the literature, and brought some new ideas in the field of poetry. So the poets who carried out the aesthetic movement and wrote poetry in that perspective are Oscar Wilde, Ernest Dowson, Lionel Pigott Johnson, Arthur Symons. Okay, so I would like to conclude this lecture by saying that the fleshly school poets or the pre-Raphaelites were inspired by the Italian painter before Raphael. Okay, so this is something which I have not disclosed till now, is that from where the name pre-Raphaelite has been derived. It has been derived from the Italian painters before Raphael. Raphael was a master painter in Italy. It means that when we talk about the art in Italy and the painting in Italy, so the one big name that comes into the mind is Raphael. So there were other painters in Italy as well before Raphael. They were basically Digi Rossetti and others. So that is why the pre-Raphaelites are called. Pre means before, so it means that the painters who were before Raphael, that is why it is called as pre-Raphaelite, and they were inspired by the Italian painters. And it is also called as fleshly school because it has sensuous appeal. The poetry these poets used to write it has uh, sensuous appeal. In 1848, a group of three young painters who were also poets founded the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So this concept, I hope that it has been cleared. They followed a medieval outlook, art for the sake of art, sensuous and clear word painting, and a poetry rich in music and melody. So it has been summarized that they followed a medieval look that is related to the Middle Ages. Alright, I have already explained it. Art for the sake of art, like art only for the purpose of getting pleasure out of it, for the sake of enjoyment. Sensuous, that is related to your senses. Clear word painting means there. It seems that the whatever they were writing, it is a kind of painting they were doing with the help of words, and a poetry rich in music and melody. And the structure of the poems were such that it was considered, or it was like that they are writing poetry in the form of music and melody.